Memory did not begin as a mind looking backward. That is already too late, already too human, already dependent on a self that can say something happened and I was there. Before that, there had to be a more primitive miracle, a quieter permission in the field. Something had to remain long enough for another moment to find it. Something had to survive transition without disappearing into total newness. Without memory, motion would be meaningless. Movement could happen, but nothing would carry. A state could become another state, but the first state would leave no trace, no influence, no residue, no pressure inside the next. Existence would not develop, because development requires accumulation. It would only flicker, endlessly beginning without ever becoming. This is the first rupture in the ordinary idea of memory. Memory is not primarily storage. Storage is a later function, a refined behavior of systems that already know how to preserve imprint. The deeper memory tone is continuity itself, the law that allows one moment to enter another without being fully erased. It is not a library. It is the first refusal of total disappearance. At the pre-universe layer, there are no faces to remember, no places to revisit, no past lives to recover, no identity moving through incarnation. Those are downstream expressions. The earlier question is more severe. Why does any past exist at all? Why does a pattern remain referable after it changes? Why does reality not vanish completely at the edge of every instant? The first vector must stay with the mechanics, because if memory is misunderstood here, everything downstream becomes sentimental. Motion created transition. Boundary created form. But transition and form are still insufficient. A form can appear and vanish without continuity. A movement can occur and leave nothing behind. Memory is the tone that lets existence keep a trace of its own movement. This trace is not a thought. It is not information in the human sense. It is persistence of effect. The field changes, and the change does not fully evacuate itself. Something of the change remains present as condition. That remaining becomes the earliest form of memory, not because anything is remembering it, but because the field is no longer innocent of what occurred. This is where memory becomes unsettling. If a thing leaves a trace, then nothing is entirely isolated. Every motion becomes part of the conditions that follow it. Every boundary shapes more than itself. Every polarity leaves pressure in the field. Memory is therefore the first architecture of consequence. Once memory exists, reality cannot pretend that nothing happened. A quiet objection rises here. If there is no mind yet, who is doing the remembering? That question comes from the human habit of putting a person behind every function. But at this depth, memory does not require a person. A footprint does not require someone to narrate it before it affects the ground. A vibration does not require a historian before it alters what can resonate afterward. The field remembers first by being changed. This is why memory is older than identity. Identity is a pattern that can recognize itself across change. But before recognition, there must be continuity for recognition to use. Something has to connect the previous state to the present state. Without that connective trace, identity cannot form, because every moment would be a stranger to every other moment. The self would have no thread. The earliest memory tone is therefore not personal, it is relational. It allows one state to stand in relation to another across transition. This is the root of before and after, not time as a measurement. but time as meaningful difference carried forward. Before memory, sequence is possible but empty. After memory, sequence begins to matter. Stay with that distinction because it changes the entire field. Motion creates sequence, but memory makes sequence cumulative. Boundary creates form, but memory lets form retain continuity through change. Polarity creates contrast, but memory lets contrast become learning rather than isolated sensation. Without memory, even contrast would never deepen. It would only recur without recognition. This is why existence could not become wise without memory. Wisdom is not information. Wisdom is pattern consequence retained long enough to shape future movement. The field learns because it is not completely reset. Every retained trace becomes a pressure toward refinement. Memory allows reality to become less random without becoming fixed. Now the second vector must enter lived experience, because this teaching will become too cold if it stays cosmic. You know this tone every time your body responds before your mind understands why. A smell tightens the chest. A room makes the stomach drop. A voice warms something you thought had gone silent. You call it instinct, trauma, familiarity, intuition, or nostalgia, depending on the story available to you. But beneath those names is the same mechanism. Something previous remains active inside the present. Your body is not only reacting to what is happening now, it is responding to traces that still shape how now is received. Memory does not stay behind you. It arrives with you into every moment and edits what the moment can become. This is why two people can live through the same outer event and inhabit completely different realities. The event is not meeting an empty field. It is meeting a field already marked. One person hears criticism where another hears care. One person feels danger where another feels invitation. One person experiences silence as peace, another as abandonment. Memory determines what the present is allowed to mean. That can sound like imprisonment, and sometimes it feels that way. The past seems to keep walking into rooms before you do. You try to be new, but an old trace speaks through your nervous system. You try to trust, but your body remembers betrayal before your mind can negotiate. You try to rest, but rest feels unsafe because somewhere in the field, stillness once meant vulnerability. This is where memory becomes both gift and burden. Without it, you cannot learn. With it, you can repeat. Without it, nothing would carry forward. With it, too much can carry forward unchanged. The same tone that allows continuity can also preserve distortion. Memory saves the thread, but it can also keep a knot alive. A second objection rises from the part of the listener that wants freedom. If memory shapes the present, am I trapped by what came before? Not necessarily, but you are not untouched by it either. Freedom is not the absence of memory. Freedom is the ability to meet memory consciously enough that it stops ruling from beneath awareness. A past that is denied does not disappear. It becomes atmosphere. This is why healing is not forgetting. Forgetting can sometimes be relief, but it is not transformation. Transformation happens when the trace changes function. The old imprint no longer dictates the same response. The body can remember and still choose differently. The moment memory becomes conscious enough to be repatterned, continuity stops being a chain and becomes a thread you can work with. This is also why some memories feel older than this life. The human story may not contain their origin, but the body carries the pressure of them anyway. Certain fears arrive without biography. Certain longings arrive without explanation. Certain people feel familiar before history can justify it. These are not proofs to be thrown away carelessly. They are signs that memory is larger than the conscious archive. Now the third vector must widen beyond the personal, because memory is not only inside individuals. Cultures remember, families remember, places remember, institutions remember. A house can hold the rhythm of grief long after the conversation ended. A family can repeat a survival strategy for generations without anyone naming the first wound. A culture can inherit fear and call it tradition. Collective memory is not always written in books. It often lives in reflexes. What a community avoids saying, what it praises too quickly, what it punishes before it understands, what it teaches children to fear without explaining why. These are memory tones moving through social bodies. They shape perception before conscious debate begins. This is why history never stays in the past merely because a date has passed. If the trace remains active, the event is still participating. A society may change laws while keeping old patterns alive in tone, habit, expectation, and distribution of trust. The surface moves forward, but the memory field continues organizing behavior. That is why unresolved collective memory returns as conflict. It is not trying to be dramatic, it is trying to become conscious. Memory in a collective can preserve wisdom or preserve injury. It can carry songs, rights, skills, languages, responsibilities, and warnings. It can also carry resentment, distortion, inherited enemies, and unconscious shame. The issue is not that the collective remembers, the issue is whether it remembers clearly. Unclear memory becomes myth used as weapon. Clear memory becomes continuity used as guidance. A culture with damaged memory loses proportion. It overreacts to symbols while ignoring structures. It repeats slogans because it has forgotten the cost that made the slogans necessary. It romanticizes origins it never understood. It treats novelty as liberation because it cannot feel what wisdom it is abandoning. Without coherent memory, a people can move constantly and still lose its soul. This is why erasing memory is not healing at scale. A culture that refuses to remember becomes easy to manipulate. It loses the ability to recognize patterns returning under new names. It mistakes repetition for surprise. It becomes vulnerable to old errors wearing modern clothing. Memory is not merely remembrance of pain. It is the immune system of meaning. Now the three vectors can begin to turn toward one another, but not collapse into comfort. Cosmically, memory is persistence of trace. Personally, memory is the way previous imprint shapes present meaning. Collectively, memory is the continuity field through which groups repeat, heal, distort, or refine themselves. In all three layers, memory is not passive. It is active architecture. The core insight now sharpens. Existence began remembering itself before any being could say, I remember. The field remembered by remaining unchanged. The body remembers by carrying response. The culture remembers by repeating patterns. This means memory is not an object stored somewhere. Memory is the living pressure of what has not been fully resolved, fully integrated, or fully released. That pressure can become wisdom when it is metabolized. It can become destiny when it is refined. It can become bondage when it is unconscious. It can become identity when a pattern recognizes itself across enough change to say, this is still me. But that statement, even before language, depends on memory holding continuity long enough for sameness and difference to meet. This is where the listener should feel themselves inside the teaching. Every time you say, I am not who I was, you are relying on memory. Every time you say, I am still myself, you are relying on memory. Every time you recognize growth, regret, return, healing, or relapse, you are standing inside the tone that lets a present compare itself with a past. Without that tone, no growth could be known because nothing could be carried forward to measure transformation. And that creates the final pressure of this first movement. Memory is not only what saves the past from disappearance, it is what makes change accountable. Once memory exists, transformation can be judged against what came before. A promise can be kept or broken. A wound can be repeated or healed. A life can either become more coherent through its traces or become more trapped by them. So the question is not whether you remember. You do, even when you think you do not. Your patterns remember. Your attractions remember. Your hesitations remember. Your body remembers. Your field remembers. The deeper question is whether what you carry has become conscious enough to change shape. Because once existence began remembering itself, nothing could ever again be merely new. Every new movement arrived carrying echoes, depths, openings, residues, inheritances, and unfinished requests from what came before. That is the gravity of memory tones. They do not keep the past behind you. They reveal that the past has always been one of the materials from which the present is built. The first mistake is believing that memory exists to preserve the past. That understanding felt stable because it explained why continuity matters. It explained why growth can occur, why identity can persist, and why consequence can accumulate rather than vanish. But the moment that explanation becomes complete, a deeper problem appears beneath it. If memory alone preserves what already happened, then memory is fundamentally passive, and a passive force cannot explain the astonishing influence memory exerts over reality. The listener may immediately resist this. Human experience appears to confirm that memory looks backward. You remember childhood. You remember yesterday. You remember decisions already made. Everything about ordinary perception suggests that memory is a record of completed events. Yet ordinary perception is observing the visible expression of memory rather than the deeper function beneath it. A river leaves traces along its banks, but those traces do not merely describe where the river has been. They also influence where the river will flow next. The imprint begins participating in future movement. The remembered path becomes a tendency. The tendency becomes a probability. The probability becomes a shaping force. Suddenly, memory is no longer preserving reality, it is helping create reality. This changes the pressure entirely. In the first movement, memory appeared as continuity. It allowed one moment to survive long enough to influence another. That remains true, but it is incomplete. Memory does not simply carry the past into the future. Memory actively organizes the future around the past. The trace does not sit quietly behind experience. It reaches forward into experience before experience arrives. This becomes visible everywhere once seen clearly. A person who expects rejection does not merely remember previous rejection. Their memory begins selecting, emphasizing, and anticipating signals that reinforce its own continuity. The remembered wound starts participating in future perception. The future arrives already edited. The memory becomes partially responsible for what it believes it is merely observing. Notice how destabilizing this becomes. The first movement allowed memory to appear as a container. The container feels manageable. A container stores things. A container preserves information. But memory behaves less like a container and more like an attractor. It bends interpretation. It shapes expectation. It alters probability. It influences what the field is most likely to become. The objection immediately arises. If memory helps shape the future, then are people trapped inside old patterns forever? The answer appears obvious at first, yet becomes less obvious under examination. Many people escape old patterns. Many people transform dramatically. Many people become almost unrecognizable compared to earlier versions of themselves. Something larger than memory must be therefore operating. But identifying that larger force introduces another problem. Transformation itself depends on memory. A person cannot transcend a pattern that leaves no trace. The pattern must first persist long enough to be encountered. The wound must remain active long enough to be recognized. The distortion must survive long enough to become visible. Memory creates the very conditions transformation requires. Without memory, there would be no prison, but there would also be no liberation. The first vector, therefore, begins to invert itself. Memory is not merely preserving continuity. Memory is preserving the possibility of evolution. Growth requires resistance. Resistance requires persistence. Persistence requires memory. The listener who wishes for complete forgetting may unknowingly be wishing away the very mechanism that makes transformation possible. Yet even this understanding stabilizes too quickly. Another destabilization waits underneath it. The listener still imagines memory as something that belongs to existence. Memory appears to be a feature reality developed. Memory appears to be one function among many. Motion exists. Boundaries exist. Memory exists. They seem like neighboring principles. But what if memory occupies a deeper position than that? Consider what happens when memory is removed entirely, not reduced, not weakened, removed. Motion becomes impossible to detect because detection requires comparison. Boundaries become impossible to recognize because recognition requires reference. Difference itself becomes impossible because difference depends on relating one state to another. The entire architecture begins collapsing. This is where the second vector begins. Memory may not merely support existence. Memory may be one of the conditions that allows existence to appear at all. Without memory, there can be no meaningful distinction between one state and another. Without distinction, motion disappears. Without motion, development disappears. Without development, reality becomes an eternal instant incapable of self-relationship. The mind struggles here because human memory appears fragile. People forget names. People forget conversations. People forget where they place their keys. Human memory feels unreliable, which creates the illusion that memory itself is secondary. But personal memory and foundational memory are not the same thing. The failure of one does not imply the weakness of the other. A person suffering memory loss still inhabits a reality where continuity exists. The sun rises according to remembered patterns. Language retains remembered meanings. Relationships retain remembered structures. The world continues referencing itself even when the individual struggles to do so. This suggests that memory operates beneath the personal level long before it reaches conscious awareness. The listener encounters this constantly without noticing. Language itself is memory. Meaning itself is memory. Every symbol only functions because previous encounters remain active enough to inform present interpretation. Remove memory completely and words become random shapes. Remove memory completely and identity becomes impossible to maintain for more than an instant. Remove memory completely and reality loses coherence faster than thought can track. This pressure forces another uncomfortable possibility into view. Memory may be less like a record and more like a field. Records contain information. Fields organize behavior. Records preserve. Fields influence. If memory behaves as a field, then existence is not simply carrying traces of the past. It is continuously operating within the influences of accumulated traces. This becomes easier to recognize in collective experience. Entire societies move according to memories most individuals never consciously encountered. Historical traumas shape behavior centuries later. Ancient victories still influence identity long after participants are gone. Forgotten events continue generating consequences because memory fields survive the disappearance of individual rememberers. Notice what this means. A thing does not need to be consciously remembered to remain active. That statement alone destabilizes enormous portions of modern thinking. People often assume awareness determines influence, yet countless influences operate beneath awareness every day. The absence of conscious recollection does not imply the absence of memory. The third vector enters through a question that appears simple but becomes increasingly difficult to answer. What was the first thing existence remembered? The mind immediately searches for an event, perhaps a movement, perhaps a boundary, perhaps a distinction. But every answer quietly assumes memory already exists. Something more fundamental may have happened first. Perhaps the first memory was not a remembered event. Perhaps the first memory was the persistence of relationship itself. Before specific traces could accumulate, the field may have discovered how to remain connected to its own previous condition. Not content, not information, not history, relationship. This changes everything again. If the first memory was relationship rather than information, then memory is not primarily about storing what happened. Memory is about maintaining connection across change. The emphasis shifts from content to continuity. The emphasis shifts from archive to coherence. The emphasis shifts from recollection to participation. The listener can observe this in ordinary life. Two lifelong friends may forget thousands of conversations while retaining the relationship itself. A family may lose stories while preserving patterns. A culture may forget origins while maintaining inherited behaviors. The relationship survives even when content fades. Something deeper than information remains active. This suggests memory and identity have been linked incorrectly for a very long time. Most people assume identity produces memory. A self exists, then gathers experiences. But perhaps memory produces identity. Perhaps continuity creates the conditions necessary for a self to emerge. Perhaps identity is what happens when memory becomes coherent enough to recognize itself. That possibility cannot be resolved quickly because it reverses the usual order. The self no longer appears as the owner of memory. The self begins appearing as one consequence of memory. Identity becomes something generated by continuity rather than continuity being generated by identity. The relationship turns inside out. Now all three vectors begin approaching one another without fully merging. Memory shapes the future rather than merely preserving the past. Memory supports existence rather than merely participating within it. Memory may generate identity rather than merely serving it. Each realization deepens the previous one while removing certainty from the ground beneath it. The listener may feel tempted to stabilize around a new conclusion. Memory is fundamental. Memory is the answer. Memory explains everything. But that stabilization arrives too early. A deeper tension remains unresolved. If memory preserves continuity, shapes possibility, and generates identity, then memory itself must somehow persist. Something must allow memory to survive its own transformations. The question therefore shifts once again. The issue may no longer be why existence remembers itself. The issue may become how memory remembers memory, how continuity survives continuity, how the thread remains connected even while the pattern woven from that thread changes endlessly. That pressure remains unfinished because the deeper one looks, the less memory resembles a function and the more it resembles a foundational condition of reality itself, not merely a way of preserving existence. A way existence remains related to itself across change. And once that possibility enters the field, the meaning of memory becomes far larger than anything contained within a personal past.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.